January 17, 1945. Somewhere along the snow-covered rail junction near Koblenz, Western Germany. The morning arrives without ceremony. A thin fog clings to the frozen earth, and the rhythmic clatter of iron wheels on steel track cuts through the silence like a heartbeat. A German freight train rolls westward, its cars laden with Tiger tank components, artillery shells, and winter uniforms destined for divisions bleeding along the collapsing Western Front. In the locomotive cab, the engineer exhales vapor into the cold air, his gloved hands steady on the throttle. Behind him, 67 cars stretch into the mist like a mechanical serpent, vital and vulnerable. The rails beneath him hum with the weight of the Reich's dwindling logistical lifeline. He does not hear the engines above the clouds. Not yet. For 4 years, these rails have been the arteries of German military power. They carried panzers east toward Moscow, south toward the Caucasus oil fields, west toward the Atlantic Wall. They moved coal from the Ruhr, steel from Essen, men from Bavaria and Saxony to every contested front. The German war machine, for all its tanks and aircraft and industrial might, depended on one unchanging truth: that the trains would run, that the rails would hold, that the connections between production and consumption, between factory and front line, would remain intact. It was an assumption built into every strategic calculation, every timetable, every operation order. The Reichsbahn, the German state railway, had become as essential to victory as ammunition itself. In the winter of 1945, that assumption was dying. The engineer hears it first, a distant insect-like drone growing louder, multiplying, converging. He looks up through the frost-etched glass of his cabin window and sees them, dark silhouettes tearing through the cloud layer, their wings catching the pale morning light. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, 8 of them, maybe 10, descending in a staggered line like birds of prey locked onto scent. The engineer's hand moves instinctively toward the brake lever, but it is far too late for braking. The first fighter peels off and dives, its 850 caliber machine guns opening fire like the sound of tearing fabric magnified 1,000 times. Tracers arc through the frozen air and slam into the locomotive's boiler with brutal precision. Metal shrieks, steam erupts in a scalding white plume. The train lurches, shudders, and begins to die. What follows is not a battle. It is an execution. The P-47s circle and strike again and again, each pass methodical, savage, efficient. Rockets streak from under their wings and explode among the rail cars, tearing apart ammunition crates, igniting fuel drums, splitting steel like paper. The engineer abandons his post and runs through the snow, stumbling, gasping, his ears ringing from the concussive blasts. Behind him, the train becomes a writhing column of fire and smoke, its cargo scattered across the embankment in twisted, burning fragments. The rails themselves warp under the heat, bending into grotesque shapes that will take weeks to repair, if they are repaired at all. Within 5 minutes, the attack is over. The Thunderbolts climb back into the clouds and vanish westward, leaving behind nothing but ruin and silence. This scene, repeated thousands of times across occupied Europe in the final years of the war, was not an accident. It was the result of a calculated, relentless campaign waged by American air power against the one thing the German military could not replace quickly enough: its transportation infrastructure. The rails, the junctions, the bridges and marshalling yards that kept armies fed, fueled, and fighting. The destruction of these lifelines would become one of the most decisive and underappreciated factors in the collapse of Nazi Germany, a collapse not merely of men and machines, but of the very network that sustained them. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, one must first understand what the rails represented to Germany. Unlike the United States, with its sprawling highway systems and decentralized logistics, Germany had built its war economy around the Reichsbahn. The railway network was dense, efficient, and deeply integrated into every layer of military planning. Divisions moved by rail, supplies moved by rail, entire offensives were timed around the capacity of specific rail corridors to deliver the necessary tonnage of material. When the Wehrmacht planned operations, staff officers did not merely count tanks and infantry regiments, they counted rail schedules, rolling stock availability, the carrying capacity of key junctions. Logistics was not an afterthought, it was the foundation upon which German strategy rested.
And for much of the war, it worked. In 1940, German trains moved entire panzer divisions into position for the invasion of France with clockwork precision. In 1941, they ferried millions of soldiers eastward for Operation Barbarossa. The rails were Germany's silent partner in conquest, invisible but indispensable. They did not win battles, but they made battles possible. American intelligence officers understood this long before the first P-47 strafed its first locomotive. They studied maps, analyzed railway routes, calculated throughput rates. They recognized that Germany's strength was also its vulnerability. If the rails could be cut, the entire system would seize. Tanks without fuel would become pillboxes. Artillery without shells would fall silent. Divisions without food would wither. The question was not whether to target the rails, but how to do so effectively and at scale. The answer came in the form of the 9th Air Force's tactical fighter bombers, and chief among them the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt was not beautiful. It was heavy, blunt-nosed, and brutally functional, a machine built to absorb punishment and deliver devastation. Pilots called it the Jug for its resemblance to a milk jug, thick and sturdy. It weighed 7 tons fully loaded, more than twice the weight of its nimble British counterpart, the Spitfire. But what it lacked in grace, it made up for in firepower and survivability. 8.5 caliber machine guns capable of firing 800 rounds per minute each. Hardpoints for bombs, rockets, napalm canisters. An air-cooled radial engine that could absorb flak damage and keep flying. The P-47 was not designed to dance with enemy fighters at high altitude, though it could. It was designed to descend into the chaos of low-level ground attack and emerge intact. By late 1944, squadrons of Thunderbolts were operating from captured airfields in France and Belgium, ranging deep into German-held territory on daily armed reconnaissance missions. Their orders were simple: find anything that moves and destroy it. Trains were priority targets. Pilots learned to recognize the telltale plumes of locomotive smoke from miles away, the glint of sunlight on steel rails, the clustered rooftops of marshalling yards. They learned to attack from the side or rear to avoid return fire from flak cars positioned on the trains themselves. They learned to aim for the locomotive first, cripple the engine, and the entire train becomes a stationary target. The German railway crews came to dread the sound of American engines. Unlike the high-altitude bombers that struck predictably and could sometimes be evaded through timing and dispersal, the fighter bombers appeared without warning, skimming treetops, exploiting gaps in cloud cover, hunting with predatory patience. A train crew might travel 50 kilometers in relative safety, only to be caught in the open on a straight section of track with no cover, no escape, and seconds to react. The psychological toll was immense. Veteran engineers, men who had survived years of war, refused to operate daytime runs. Schedules collapsed, delays multiplied. The Reichsbahn, once a model of Germanic efficiency, began to fracture under the weight of sustained aerial assault. They had expected resilience. They had expected German industry to adapt, to harden and endure as it had during the strategic bombing campaigns against cities and factories. Instead, they found fragility. German officials and military planners had long believed their rail network to be too vast, too redundant, too essential to be truly crippled. There were backup routes, secondary junctions, repair crews standing by. Surely, they reasoned, the Allies could not destroy every kilometer of track, every bridge, every locomotive. Surely the sheer scale of the network would absorb the damage. They were wrong. The photographs circulated among Allied intelligence officers as proof of concept. This was not the result of a single raid, but of weeks of sustained pressure. The yard had been struck, repaired, struck again, repaired again, until finally the Germans abandoned it altogether. The trains stopped coming. The rails fell silent. What had once been a critical node in the logistics network became a monument to its own collapse. German soldiers, withdrawing westward under relentless pressure, saw these ruins and understood what they meant. The war was not merely being lost on the battlefield, it was being lost in the rail yards, on the sidings, in the choke points where supply met demand and found nothing but absence. They had been taught to believe in German engineering, in the superiority of organization and will. They had been told that discipline and determination would prevail. But no amount of discipline could conjure fuel from empty tank cars. No amount of determination could fire artillery shells that never arrived. The realization settled over the retreating columns like the winter cold. They were not being outfought. They were being starved. The P-47 became a symbol, though the pilots themselves rarely understood it. To them, the missions were technical exercises. Locate target, dive, fire, pull up, return to base. Debrief, rest, repeat. They did not see the cascading effects of their attacks, the way each destroyed locomotive rippled outward through the logistics network, amplifying shortages, compounding delays. They did not see the German staff officers poring over rail schedules that no longer matched reality, improvising reroutes that only created new bottlenecks. They did not see the soldiers at the front, hungry and cold, staring down roads empty of supply trucks, cursing the skies. But the effect was undeniable. By April 1945, entire German armies were operating on fumes. The 5th Panzer Army, encircled in the Ruhr, had fuel for less than a day of movement. Army Group G, defending the southern approaches, could no longer coordinate defensive operations because units could not be supplied or reinforced in time. The once mighty Wehrmacht, which had conquered half a continent, had been reduced to isolated pockets of resistance, each one cut off, undersupplied, waiting for relief that would never come. The rails, Germany's great strategic asset, had become a liability. Every remaining line was a target. Every train that moved risked annihilation. The Reichsbahn, unable to function and unable to stop, ground itself into irrelevance. There is poetry, bitter and cold, in the way it ended. The final German trains did not move armies or tanks. They moved refugees fleeing westward ahead of the advancing Red Army. They moved wounded soldiers, evacuated from field hospitals that could no longer be defended. They moved bureaucrats and party officials, clutching briefcases full of meaningless orders. And even these trains, desperate and pitiful, were hunted. American pilots, patrolling the skies over a disintegrating Reich, still followed their orders, anything that moves. The distinction between military and civilian had blurred into irrelevance. The rails had become symbols not of German strength, but its collapse, fragile, burning, scattered across the landscape like the broken spine of a dying empire.
In the end, it was not the grand battles that destroyed Germany's capacity to wage war. It was the silent, methodical severing of the connections that made those battles possible. It was the train that never arrived, the fuel that never flowed, the ammunition that never reached the gun. It was the realization, spreading like cold through the bones of an army, that the machinery of war had stopped, not because it was defeated in combat, but because it could no longer move.
The rails still run through Germany today, rebuilt, modernized, efficient once more. Trains carry commuters and cargo, tourists and trade. The scars are gone, paved over, forgotten. But the lesson remains, carved into the strategic calculus of every military planner who studies the war. Victory is not merely a matter of firepower or manpower. It is a matter of logistics, of supply, of the unbroken line between production and consumption, between factory and frontline. And it is a reminder of what American air power brought to the war. Not just bombs and bullets, but abundance. The abundance to build thousands of fighter bombers, to train tens of thousands of pilots, to fuel endless sorties, to replace losses and sustain pressure day after day, week after week, until the enemy's capacity to resist simply collapsed. Germany had the will to fight. It had skilled soldiers, advanced technology, battlefield experience. What it did not have, in the end, was enough. Enough trains, enough fuel, enough time. The P-47s flew on, indifferent and relentless, and the rails burned beneath them. And in that burning, a truth emerged, that modern war is won not only on the battlefield, but in the rail yards and supply depots, in the quiet, unglamorous work of severing the enemy's lifelines. That freedom, in the end, is sustained not by ideology alone, but by the capacity to deliver overwhelming material power, and the will to use it without hesitation. The trains stopped running, and with them, the war machine died.